everyone, my name is Reggie and today I will be sharing with you my April wrap-up. In the month of April, I read 9 books, which is pretty awesome, so let's just get into those books. The first book I read in the month of April is Luckiest Girl Alive by Jessica Knoll. This is an adult thriller that I've been itching to get my hands on since it first came out because it was getting a lot of buzz when it first came out. I think that was 2 summers ago, I don't quite recall, but I never did pick it up, and so I finally grabbed a copy to borrow, and it was just so much more than I expected. Because if you look at the reviews on this book, it got a lot of like 2 or 3 stars because at first it was getting all that buzz. It got a lot of high reviews, and then a lot of more people picked it up and felt it was overhyped. Happens a lot. You guys probably have had it happen to you. So I wasn't really sure what to expect coming into this book, but it was very good. I really enjoyed it, and I gave it like a 4.5 out of 5 stars. I really did enjoy the story. This is a story of Ani, who is a 20-something, and she's living in New York, and she is a journalist of sorts. She works for a woman's magazine. She is engaged to be married. This story does go back and forth between the present and the past. So the past perspective is Ani as a high school student named Tiffany during a time where something traumatic happened, and the story is leading up to that traumatic incident and what happened and trying to figure things out, as well as her dealing with her current life and how that past traumatic incident affects everything that's happening today and the choices she makes. I really enjoyed this book. I also really enjoyed how after we find out the traumatic incident, we get aftermath of it. We get a kind of falling out of it and a really interesting and good conclusion, in my opinion. Ani is not the most likable character, but she's not supposed to be, and you see why she acts the way she does throughout the course of the story, and it was just a lot more than I thought it was going to be going in because I really didn't know that much about it. I will say there should be a trigger warning on this book for sexual assault and gun violence. I think it's important you know that going in. Those are aspects of the book that could be triggering to you. Next up, I read Lean In by Cheryl Strandberg. This is a book I never picked up when it first came out and first became very popular, and I felt it was time, and I did actually really enjoy this. I listened to the audiobook, which I don't believe was actually narrated by Cheryl Strandberg. Cheryl Strandberg is a COO for Facebook, and she talks a lot in this book just about how women have to deal with being a potential person in the workplace and how to balance. She talks about the glass ceiling. It's very, very good. It's not like the best. It's not the end all be all, but I think it got a lot of unnecessary crap. I think it's still very interesting and very good. I really enjoy her perspective. It's not the end all be all perspective. It is a very privileged, white, cisgendered, able-bodied woman's perspective. While that's being said, I still think she provides a very interesting and thorough look at corporate America and women in business and women in the workplace, and I think her perspective is very valid. It's just not the only perspective that needs to be said. I gave this book 4 out of 5 stars, though I did really enjoy it. Next, I read Someday Someday Maybe by Lauren Graham. This is Lauren Graham's fiction novel, her writing debut, and this was fan-freaking-tastic. I gave it 3 out of 5 stars, so like it wasn't the best story ever, but I really wasn't expecting that much going into it. So I really, really enjoyed the story. It's about a young girl who is trying to be an actress. She has moved to New York City. She has given herself a timeline of when she needs to have made it. Otherwise, she's going to give up and move on to another career path and decide that acting isn't for her, and she is quickly approaching her timeline as the story begins. And I found this to be a really interesting look at, you know, life in your 20s. We don't get a lot of those books. I feel like they're all like too late or too early. So it was nice to have that perspective and this like kind of trying to figure yourself out story. Did really enjoy that. It was a little cheesy and contrived and like, you know, but I mean, Lauren Graham is an author, and I knew that going in like she is now. But I mean, like, she doesn't have a huge background in writing. She does have experience with acting, so it was a very honest portrayal of the situations that were being presented in this novel, but she's not necessarily an author, so she didn't necessarily have nuances of a story by a seasoned author. I mean, like, that's gonna happen with a lot of debut authors, so it's not a big deal. I just think those are important things for you to know if you are interested in picking up this book, but I still really enjoyed it, but it was a 3 out of 5 stars for me. It didn't blow me away in terms of, like, anything I've ever read, but it did blow me away from Lauren Graham because I love her to pieces, but I just didn't expect this book to be what it was. It was very enjoyable and very quick paced. Next up, I read The Last Star by Rick Yancey. This is the third and final book in the Fifth Wave trilogy. I finally picked up this book. I gave this a 3.5 or 4 out of 5 stars. I'm still kind of sitting on it thinking about it. I think the ending in particular was a lot weaker than the rest of the story, and by story I mean the entire trilogy. I mean, a lot of people were devastated by the events that happened. I didn't cry. I wasn't that sad about it. Like, I totally saw this coming and definitely expected it. I just really hated the, like, epilogue. I don't know what it is about me and epilogues. I never like them. I hated the Hunger Games epilogue. I do not like the Harry Potter epilogue. I just disliked this epilogue so much. I don't want things tied up in a pretty package, I guess. I don't want the bow on top. I'm okay without that. But the epilogue in this particularly was probably my least favorite out of the ones I've mentioned. It was just too much. It was too much for me. And it just really didn't end how I wanted it to, I guess. So there's that. However, I think it was a really interesting journey to the conclusion, and I did really enjoy my time getting there. And when I say ending, I don't mean the ending of the story. I mean the epilogue. It was just that cheesy and uncomfortable for me. Next up, I read Saga Volume 7, written by Brian K. Vaughan and illustrated by the lovely Fiona Staples. This was fantastic. Oh my gosh, this story broke my heart. Brian K. Vaughan is a very cruel human being. Very, 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 very cruel. But the story was very impactful for me. I really enjoyed the development and the kind of look at another planet and a new world. Our characters are kind of stuck on a different planet for the course of this bind up, and I really enjoyed exploring a new part of the world because I do really like the world that Saga is set in. It's very complex and interesting, and I also really liked some of the character development aspects we saw within it, but it was the saddest of all the sagas, and Saga's not like the happiest of stories. There's some sad parts, so be prepared, guys. Next up, I listened to The Handmaid's Tale by the one, the only Margaret Atwood. It's a very enjoyable and interesting dystopian, and it feels very relevant and very, like, current, which is, you know, scary. But this is a dystopian world in which women have basically lost all of their rights. And this story follows one of our handmaids in this new world, and a handmaid is basically a person used for breeding purposes. The process is very scientific and uncomfortable and unpleasant, and it, you know, we get into it. And I do applaud Margaret Atwood's use of uncomfortable scenes to heighten this dystopian world because it really makes it feel very dystopian, very uncomfortable. Things are scary right now, especially for women and women's health, and so it does feel very current in terms of that. I also really enjoyed that this is the kind of progression to the dystopian. Most of the time in dystopians, at least in the dystopians I've read and in YA dystopians particularly, we're picking up the story after the issue has happened. Typically these are people who were born into the world and it was already this dystopian way. In The Handmaid's Tale, our protagonist has flashbacks of, you know, the times when she went to go buy a pack of cigarettes and her debit card didn't work because that was the day they took women's rights away to have their own money, the day she was let go from her job because that was the day the government said women can no longer hold working positions. Like, she has these flashbacks to the coming of the dystopian era, and that was very interesting, and I really enjoyed that aspect. Margaret Atwood's writing is fine. Her characters were really interesting. I just found the story of present day kind of boring, and I didn't really like where the story ended up going. I also really hated the use of the color red. It was so heavy-handed. I felt like I couldn't go a page without her mentioning the color red. The house was red. Her clothes were red. The street was red. Like, every freaking thing was red, and it just felt way too heavy-handed for me. I couldn't get over that. But I did enjoy a lot of aspects of this novel, so I did give it 4 out of 5 stars. Next up, I finally read the last book in the Vampire Academy series, which is The Last Sacrifice by Rochelle Mead. I loved the first 5 books in the series. I especially loved the first 3. 4 was okay, 5 was fantastic. 6 honestly was my least favorite in the series. I just did not like the conclusion. I think this goes back to me disliking things that are tied up in a pretty bow. This was like not the most satisfying conclusion for me, and I didn't like the journey to the conclusion either. I found the ending just disheartening. Like, the whodunit of this part of the story was just like unnecessary. But, I mean, that is relative to the rest of the story. I still really enjoyed this book, and I love this series so very much. So I gave this book a 3.5 out of 5 stars. Next up, I read Clawford Princess by Cassandra Clare. Look, this was my least favorite Cassandra Clare book. I thought it was City of Lost Souls. No. It's actually pretty much everyone's favorite. Cassandra Clare book is my least favorite. Guys, how? Why? This ending. That epilogue. You guys said I was gonna cry. You were liars. I was fuming. I wanted to kick something, but I was at work, so I couldn't. Not gonna get into it. I love the characters in the first 2 books. I love the love story in the first 2 books. So maybe it was distance from the 2nd book and the 3rd book. Maybe if I would have reread it would have been better. Honestly though, I don't think so. I found the story was very boring. I found that not enough happened. I found that the ending especially, and by ending I mean that epilogue, was just atrocious. I found the ending pre-epilogue to be predictable. What happened to Jem I called in City of Lost Souls. It's so freaking predictable, guys. That's the thing I just disliked so much about Cassandra Clare's books, is like every single thing is so predictable. I gave this book a 2 out of 5 stars. Sorry. After that, because I'm a masochist and because I had the book ready from the library, I read City of Heavenly Fire by Cassandra Clare. Who would have ever thought that I'd like a Mortal Instruments book better than an Infernal Devices book? But I did. Not by a lot. Not by a lot at all. But I found this to be an okay conclusion. I still really dislike Cassandra Clare's conclusions to books. I don't like her conclusions to series. If City of Glass was the conclusion to the Mortal Instruments series, I would have thought that was a fantastic conclusion. I thought that was great. I just feel like the stakes were just not high enough and not enough people perished. I don't like the redemption arcs that were trying to be weaved in. I did really enjoy the journey to the ending though. This was the exact opposite for Clawford Princess and me. I really enjoyed the events that were happening. The journey to the conclusion was entertaining enough. But that ending really just wasn't good enough for me to give this a great rating. I gave this 3 out of 5 stars. That's like my standard go-to Cassandra Clare rating. Her books are enjoyable enough to read. I don't love them. I don't really like them all that much. But I, for the most part, don't dislike them enough to call them like books I disliked until Clockwork Princess. But yeah, I gave this 3 out of 5 stars. I will be reading Tales from the Shadowhunter Academy, I guess. I really didn't like how Simon's story ended. I just really didn't like people's endings in this book. Like you're undoing all your work from... Stop. That was the last book I read in the month of April. I would love it if you give this video a thumbs up and subscribe, because those are super great things you can do and they really support me and my channel and they make me smile. And you should comment down below and let me know what your favorite book you read in the month was. I would say my favorite book I read this month was The Luckiest Girl Alive. I would say it definitely has its problem aspects, but it was very entertaining and very enjoyable and just a lot more than I expected. And you know, 4.5 stars is close enough to 5. See you in the next video. Bye.